following broadcast is a work of pure fiction. Names, characters, places, events, and incidents portrayed in this narration are entirely imaginary and created solely for entertainment purposes. Listener discretion is advised. If you enjoy this chilling and spine-tingling narration, please show your support by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating such immersive stories. Thank you for tuning in, and let the horror begin. This is Richard Gray, and you're listening to Frequency 121.7. Tonight, I'll tell you about the first shot, the moment the world crossed the point of no return. The irony? It didn't start with a grand declaration of war or a fiery speech by a power-hungry dictator. No, it started with a single missile, a single, terrible mistake that unraveled the fragile threads of peace we so desperately clung to. Let me take you back to December 14th, 2025, the day everything changed. The Kaliningrad Oblast, a Russian enclave nestled between Poland and Lithuania, had long been a tinderbox of geopolitical tensions. NATO forces had increased their presence in the Baltic region, conducting routine exercises that Russia deemed provocations. Moscow responded by deploying more troops to Kaliningrad, their war machines rumbling ominously close to NATO borders. The air was thick with mistrust, the kind that seeps into your bones and leaves you on edge. Soldiers on both sides were jittery, their fingers hovering over triggers. It was only a matter of time before someone slipped. And someone did. On that fateful morning, a NATO convoy carrying medical supplies veered too close to the Russian border. Satellite images showed the convoy halting after one of their vehicles suffered mechanical failure. It should have been a simple repair, an unremarkable moment in an otherwise tense situation. But Russian forces mistook the stationary convoy for an incursion. Reports from the ground later revealed a chilling miscommunication. A young Russian lieutenant, nervous and inexperienced, ordered a warning shot. A single artillery round arcs through the gray winter sky and landed 200 meters from the convoy. But what was intended as a warning became a match struck against gasoline. In the chaos that followed, a NATO drone mistook the artillery fire for an attack. Within moments, authorization was given for retaliation. A missile streaked across the sky, slamming into its target with pinpoint precision. Only the target wasn't military. It was a hospital in a small town just outside Kaliningrad. The explosion was catastrophic. Eyewitnesses described the scene as hell on earth, flames consuming the building, screams echoing through the smoke, and the charred remains of ambulances scattered like broken toys. Elena Novikova, a nurse working the night shift, was one of the few survivors. She recalled the moment the missile hit. I was in the pediatric ward, tending to a boy with a fever. The lights flickered, then everything went white. When I woke up, the ward was gone. The boy, the beds, it was all gone. Just rubble and silence, and then the screams began. Within hours, the world watched in stunned horror as images and videos of the attack flooded social media. A video shot by a Russian paramedic went viral, a shaky, blood-smeared hand capturing scenes of devastation. A father cradling his lifeless child. Nurses weeping as they pulled bodies from the wreckage. Russia's response was swift and brutal. President Nikolai Ivanov appeared on national television, his face a mask of controlled fury. This unprovoked act of aggression will not go unanswered. NATO has shown its true colors, and we will defend our people at all costs. By nightfall, Russian jets were screaming across the skies of Eastern Europe, striking NATO installations in Poland and Lithuania. Civilians in Warsaw and Vilnius huddled in basements, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of air raid sirens. Private Viktor Sokolov was stationed near Kaliningrad that day. A 21-year-old conscript, he had enlisted to help his family escape poverty. Victor had never seen combat, and nothing could have prepared him for what he witnessed. When the missile hit, we thought it was the end of the world. The ground shook, and the air smelled of burning flesh. My commanding officer screamed for us to get into defensive positions, but we were frozen. How do you prepare for something like that? Victor later described the chilling sight of NATO drones circling overhead, their engines a constant hum of death. When Russian reinforcements arrived, Victor was ordered to join a counterattack. He would never forget the faces of the civilians they encountered, terror-stricken, eyes wide with disbelief. They didn't see us as protectors. They saw us as monsters. As the sun set on December 14th, the rest of the world held its breath. Emergency meetings were called at the United Nations, but the Security Council was paralyzed. Accusations flew back and forth. NATO blamed Russia's aggression, while Russia condemned NATO's recklessness. In the United States, President Franklin Reynolds addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His voice was calm, measured, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. We are on the brink of a global conflict, the likes of which we have not seen in over a century. But let me be clear, the United States will stand with its allies and defend freedom at all costs. That night, thousands of Americans flocked to grocery stores, emptying shelves of food, water, and medical supplies. Across Europe, cities imposed curfews. Flights were grounded, borders were closed. But it wasn't enough to stop the wave of chaos that was about to engulf the world. In a small Polish village near the border, 16-year-old Anya Kowalska and her family were among the first to feel the impact. When the air raid sirens began, they ran to their cellar, clutching what little food and water they could carry. Anya described the haunting hours that followed. We could hear the jets overhead, the bombs falling in the distance. My little brother kept crying, but my mother told him to be quiet. If they hear us, they'll come, she said. But who were they? The Russians? NATO? I don't know. All I know is that when we came out, our village was gone. Their home was reduced to rubble, their neighbors either dead or missing. Anya's story was just one of thousands, innocent lives shattered in an instant. Historians would later argue that the conflict could have been contained if cooler heads had prevailed. But in the heat of the moment, revenge trumped reason. Within 48 hours, NATO officially invoked Article 5, declaring that an attack on one member was an attack on all. Russia, in turn, announced a full mobilization of its forces. China issued a chilling statement of solidarity with Russia, warning the West to back down. The Middle East braced for the inevitable spillover, as proxy wars threatened to ignite in every corner of the globe. And so the first shot was fired, not with courage or conviction, but with fear and confusion. A single missile that tore through a hospital, and with it, the thin veneer of peace we had clung to for so long. This is how it began, my friends, and it was only the beginning. This is Richard Gray, and if you're still listening, then I suppose there's still something left in you. Hope, fear, desperation. Whatever it is, I won't waste your time. Tonight, I'll tell you about the moment the world fell like a row of dominoes, each piece crashing into the next until nothing remained but chaos. It didn't happen all at once, no, these things never do. But when it started, there was no stopping it. Let me take you back to the week after the first shot, when the world began to unravel. After the hospital bombing in Kaliningrad, the world teetered on the edge of war. NATO's retaliation on Russian military bases triggered a furious response from Moscow. In less than 72 hours, both sides escalated into full-scale attacks. Airstrikes blanketed Eastern Europe. Cities that had once been bustling hubs of life, Warsaw, Vilnius, Riga, were now smoldering ruins. But the war didn't stay contained. It was like a wildfire, and every nation, no matter how far removed, was a spark waiting to ignite. On December 16, 2025, China broadcast its first official statement since the outbreak of violence. President Liu Ming appeared on national television, his voice calm, but his words laced with menace. The Western powers have destabilized global peace for too long. The time has come for balance. China stands firmly with our allies, and any attack on them will be considered an attack on us. Within hours, Chinese naval fleets moved toward the South China Sea, enforcing an immediate blockade around Taiwan. The U.S., already stretched thin with NATO commitments, scrambled to respond. Aircraft carriers were deployed, and the Pacific became a ticking time bomb. In Taiwan, panic erupted. Civilians flooded grocery stores, emptying shelves of essentials. The highways were gridlocked with people trying to flee to the mountains. One survivor, Lin Jiahao, described the sheer terror. We could hear the jets overhead, but it wasn't just the sound of war, it was the silence in between. That silence told us that the world we knew was over. As tensions escalated in Europe and Asia, old rivalries in the Middle East resurfaced. Iran, emboldened by the chaos, launched an offensive against Israel. In retaliation, Israel unleashed a barrage of missile strikes targeting Tehran and key military installations. The resulting conflict spilled over into neighboring countries. Refugees flooded into Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, overwhelming already fragile infrastructures. Camps became overcrowded and disease spread like wildfire. Ahmed al-Khatib, a Syrian doctor working in a refugee camp near the Turkish border, recounted the horrors. We had over 20,000 people in a space meant for 5,000. Children were dying of dehydration. Mothers were begging for medicine we didn't have. At night, we heard the distant explosions, and we prayed we wouldn't be next. Meanwhile, in Africa, the ripple effects of war were devastating. With global trade routes disrupted, food supplies dwindled. Countries like Somalia and Ethiopia, already struggling with famine, descended into chaos. Warlords seized the opportunity, taking control of aid shipments and imposing brutal regimes. In Lagos, Nigeria, riots broke out as food prices skyrocketed. A young journalist, Amaka Eze, recorded the haunting scenes. People were looting stores, setting them on fire afterward, as if to punish the world for what it had done to us. There were screams everywhere, but what stayed with me was the smell: burning plastic, rotting food, and blood. While Europe and Asia bore the brunt of the initial conflict, the Americas were far from untouched. In the United States, panic spread like a virus. Cities like New York and Los Angeles implemented curfews as looting and riots became rampant. In rural Montana, rancher Greg Hensley described the eerie transformation of his town. One day it was quiet. The next, there were strangers everywhere, people from the cities, desperate for food and shelter. At first we helped, but then they started taking what wasn't theirs. I've never had to shoot anyone before. South America, too, was thrown into turmoil. Brazil, dependent on exports to China and the U.S., faced economic collapse. Protests turned violent as unemployment soared. The Amazon, once a symbol of life, became a battleground as illegal loggers and miners clashed with desperate locals. One of the most harrowing stories came from Poland, where the Kowalski family joined the mass exodus toward Germany. With airstrikes leveling entire cities, highways became rivers of humanity. Families carrying whatever they could on their backs, elderly people being pushed in wheelbarrows, and children clinging to their parents in silent fear. Marta Kowalski, the matriarch, described their journey. We walked for days. There were bodies on the side of the road, some covered with blankets, others not. At night, we slept in ditches, hoping the jets wouldn't see us. My husband was killed at a checkpoint. They said he was a spy. He wasn't. He was just a father trying to keep us alive. By December 20th, the war reached Western Europe. Paris, the city of lights, went dark. An EMP strike disabled the power grid, plunging the city into chaos. Looters ransacked stores, while desperate Parisians tried to flee. Claire Dupont, a teacher, described the eerie atmosphere. The silence was the worst part. No cars, no phones, no lights, just the sound of footsteps and whispers. At night, the looters came. They had no faces, just shadows moving in the dark. We barricaded the doors, but it didn't matter. They broke in anyway. By the end of the week, the war had engulfed every corner of the globe. Stock markets crashed, currencies collapsed, and governments fell. Millions were displaced, wandering through the ruins of their former lives. But amidst the chaos, one thing became clear. No one was safe. Not the powerful, not the wealthy, and certainly not the innocent. The world had become a battlefield, and survival was the only law. And that, my friends, is how the dominoes began to fall. One by one, they toppled, until there was nothing left but dust and echoes. This is Richard Gray, signing off for now. This is Richard Gray, your voice in the dark, calling out from the ruins of what we used to call civilization. If you're still listening, hold on tight. What I'm about to tell you is not for the faint of heart. We've seen the world plunge into chaos, watched cities fall and families torn apart. But what comes next is something altogether different, something darker. Tonight, I bring you the story of the nuclear shadows, of how mankind's greatest fear became our horrifying reality. December 21st, 2025 will forever be etched into history as the day the world crossed a threshold it could never return from. It began with a single flash, brighter than 1,000 suns that lit up the skies over the Korean peninsula. North Korea, ever the unpredictable wild card, had long been a thorn in the side of the international community. As tensions between NATO, Russia, and China reached a boiling point, North Korea seized the moment to make its move. Accusing South Korea and its allies of plotting an invasion, Pyongyang launched a nuclear missile at Seoul. The explosion leveled the city in seconds. Buildings crumbled like sandcastles, and a fireball roared through the streets, consuming everything in its path. Kim Min-jae, a survivor who had been in the outskirts of Seoul when the bomb hit, described the moment. There was no warning. One moment the city was there, alive with people. The next it was gone, just light, heat, and then nothing. When I woke up, the world was silent, the kind of silence that feels like death itself. The world watched in stunned horror as news of Seoul's destruction spread. South Korea's government, or what remained of it, immediately retaliated with the backing of the United States. Within hours, B-2 bombers soared through the night sky, releasing their payloads over Pyongyang. But it didn't stop there. China, seeing the attack on its ally as a direct threat, activated its own nuclear arsenal. Beijing issued a chilling statement. The Western powers have chosen annihilation. Let them reap what they have sown. And so the chain reaction began. In South Asia, the long-standing feud between India and Pakistan reached its breaking point. As China aligned with Pakistan, India faced mounting pressure to join the Western Bloc. On December 22nd, both nations launched nuclear strikes against each other, reducing New Delhi and Islamabad to ash. A journalist, Sunita Reddy, who had been in New Delhi during the attack, recounted the apocalyptic scene. The air turned black with smoke, and the ground beneath us trembled like it was alive. People ran, but there was nowhere to go. The streets were littered with bodies. Their shadows burned into the pavement. Those shadows, they haunt me more than anything else. In Europe, NATO and Russia's conflict spiraled into a nuclear exchange by Christmas Eve. Moscow, under immense pressure and fearing an all-out invasion, launched tactical nukes against NATO forces in Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, and London were hit within hours. The United Kingdom's Prime Minister gave a final broadcast from an underground bunker, her voice trembling with emotion. To the people of Britain, I am so sorry. We did everything we could to prevent this, but the fires of war have consumed us all. Remember this moment, not with anger, but with sorrow. Remember what we've lost? On Christmas morning, 2025, the unthinkable happened. Russia launched a volley of ICBMs aimed at the United States. Missile defense systems intercepted many, but not all. Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. were among the cities hit. The White House, the Capitol, and the Pentagon were reduced to rubble. The president, along with much of the government, was killed. The country descended into chaos. In the Midwest, a farmer named Hank Lawson described watching the attack from his field. The sky turned red, and the horizon lit up like it was on fire. We felt the heat all the way out here, hundreds of miles away. I knew then that nothing would ever be the same. For those who survived the blasts, life became a waking nightmare. The air was thick with radioactive dust, choking lungs and burning skin. Food and water became more precious than gold, and what little remained was often contaminated. In the ruins of Berlin, a mother named Greta Fischer scavenged for food with her 2 children. She shared her heartbreaking story. I found a can of beans, but it was swollen, poisoned by the radiation. My youngest begged me to let him eat it, but I couldn't. I threw it away, and he cried all night. The next morning, he didn't wake up. Across the globe, entire cities became uninhabitable wastelands. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had long stood as reminders of the horrors of nuclear war, but now they were joined by dozens of others: New York, Paris, Moscow, Tokyo. These ghost cities were eerie monuments to human folly. Streets once alive with laughter and music were now silent, save for the occasional cry of a scavenger or the distant rumble of collapsing buildings. For many, the psychological scars of nuclear war were as devastating as the physical ones. Survivors spoke of vivid nightmares, hallucinations, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. Dr. Elena Petrov, a psychiatrist in a makeshift clinic in Russia, explained, "Many of my patients are haunted by the shadows, the outlines of people burned into walls and streets. They see them in their dreams, and when they wake, they can still feel their presence. It's as if the dead are screaming at us, reminding us of what we've done." By the end of December 2025, over 1 billion people were dead. The global economy had collapsed, and governments were either destroyed or reduced to fragmented, ineffective shells. But the true horror was yet to come. The nuclear fallout spread across the planet, poisoning the air, water, and soil. Crops failed, and the first signs of a nuclear winter began to appear. This is the legacy we've left ourselves, a world of shadows where the living envy the dead. If you're still listening, don't lose hope. There's a strange power in survival, in bearing witness to the end. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to rebuild. Until then, this is Richard Gray, signing off. This is Richard Gray, speaking to the scattered remnants of humanity. If you're out there, listening from your hiding places or makeshift shelters, you're not alone. Tonight, we turn our focus to the human fallout of this war. The displaced souls wandering the earth, stripped of their homes, their loved ones, and their identities. War doesn't just kill, it uproots, it fragments, it leaves people stranded in a world they no longer recognize. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story of numbers or statistics. It's a story of lives, shattered, desperate, and haunting. This is the story of the displaced souls. By January 2026, nearly half the global population had been displaced. Cities were gone, reduced to craters or radioactive wastelands. Entire countries were uninhabitable, their lands scorched and poisoned. Refugees flooded borders, overwhelming neighboring nations already teetering on the brink of collapse. The United Nations, once a symbol of international unity, ceased to function. Its last official report before communications went dark estimated over 3 billion displaced people worldwide. In Europe, the roads were choked with refugees fleeing from the east. The highways leading into Germany and France became seas of humanity. Families dragging suitcases, children clutching stuffed animals, elderly parents carried on makeshift carts. Anna, a teacher from Krakow, described her journey. We walked for days, sometimes weeks. There was no destination, just the hope that the next town might be safer. But each town was worse than the last. The air smelled of death, and the skies were always gray. My students used to ask me about the world beyond Poland. Now, all they ask is if we'll live to see tomorrow. For those who made it to the camps, survival was far from guaranteed. The camps, hastily erected in open fields and abandoned buildings, were overcrowded and undersupplied. Disease spread rapidly, and food shortages turned even the most orderly camps into riots waiting to happen. In Turkey, the Hatay refugee camp became infamous for its conditions. Originally designed to hold 10,000 people, it swelled to over 200,000 within weeks. Ahmed, a Syrian aid worker, painted a harrowing picture. The smell hits you first. Rotting garbage, human waste, sickness, it clings to everything. Children cry through the night, and mothers weep silently, clutching photographs of the families they've lost. We try to help, but what can you do when there's one doctor for every 5,000 people? In Asia, the situation was no less dire. The fall of Seoul and the devastation of Tokyo sent millions fleeing across the continent. With roads destroyed and fuel scarce, many resorted to traveling by foot or boarding overcrowded trains, if they were lucky enough to find one still running. These trains, dubbed ghost trains by survivors, became moving tombs, packed to bursting, with people hanging onto roofs and clinging to the sides. They traveled through desolate landscapes, stopping only to discard the dead. One survivor, Yuki Tanaka, recounted her experience on a train bound for northern Japan. We were crammed in so tight I could barely breathe. People fainted, but there was nowhere for them to fall. The train didn't stop for days, not even when people died. They just pushed the bodies out the doors while we kept moving. The windows were blacked out to hide us from the planes above, but we could still hear the bombs. Every time we stopped, we prayed it wasn't our turn to die. With land rendered uninhabitable in many coastal regions, some sought refuge on the seas. Improvised flotillas of fishing boats, barges, and even cruise ships became floating cities, drifting aimlessly in search of safety. In the Pacific, a fleet of over 200 vessels formed a makeshift community off the coast of what was once California. Known as the Pacific Haven, it became both a symbol of hope and a harrowing reminder of desperation. Captain Robert Mendoza, who commanded one of the ships, described the precarious existence. We called it Haven, but it was anything but. Food was scarce, and we had to fish constantly just to survive. Fresh water was even worse, rationed down to a cup a day per person. People died every week. Their bodies weighted down and dropped into the ocean. We tried to keep spirits up, but every morning you'd see more empty spaces where families used to be. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of displacement was the fate of the children. Many were separated from their families in the chaos, left to fend for themselves in a world that had no place for them. In Eastern Europe, an underground network known as the Line emerged to smuggle orphan children to safety. But even this lifeline was fraught with danger. Traffickers often intercepted the children, selling them into slavery or worse. 9-year-old Katerina, rescued from a trafficking ring in Romania, shared her chilling story. They told us we were going to a safe place. But then, they put us in trucks and locked the doors. There were so many of us, and it was so dark. I could hear the older kids crying, but I didn't cry. I was too scared. In some regions, the sheer number of displaced people led to horrifying solutions. Camps initially intended as shelters became death zones where governments and militias dumped those they couldn't care for. In Africa, the Sahel death camps became infamous. Drone footage leaked to the world showed sprawling fields of skeletal figures, too weak to stand, their skin burned from the relentless sun. A medic who escaped the camps, Dr. Emmanuel Okoye, shared the horrors he witnessed. There was no medicine, no food, no water, just people, lying on the ground, waiting to die. The guards didn't even bury the bodies anymore. They just piled them up outside the fences. I left because I couldn't take it anymore, but I still hear their cries in my sleep. Displacement wasn't just a physical ordeal, it was a mental one. The trauma of losing everything, combined with the constant threat of death, pushed many to the brink of madness. Psychiatrists, where they could still be found, reported cases of displacement delirium, a condition where survivors lost their sense of identity and reality. Many would wander aimlessly, muttering to themselves, unable to comprehend their new reality. Maria Alvarez, a psychologist working in a camp in Mexico, explained, "I met a woman who kept setting an extra place at dinner for her son, even though he died months ago. When I tried to talk to her about it, she just smiled and said, 'He'll be back soon.' It's easier to believe a lie than face the truth." By mid-2026, the displaced were no longer just survivors. They were ghosts, wandering through a broken world. Highways became graveyards, littered with abandoned possessions and unmarked graves. But even in this despair, some clung to hope. In the ruins of Paris, a group of refugees formed a choir, singing hymns amidst the rubble. In South America, a caravan of survivors planted crops in the desert, defying the odds. These small acts of defiance were a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, humanity's spirit could not be completely extinguished. They are out there, these displaced souls, searching for a place to call home in a world that no longer has one. If you are one of them, know this: you are not forgotten. Your pain, your struggle, your existence, it matters. This is Richard Gray, signing off for now. Stay safe and keep moving. The shadows may be long, but they cannot last forever. This is Richard Gray, broadcasting from nowhere and everywhere. If you're tuning in tonight, brace yourself. Because silence, it isn't the absence of sound. It's a presence, a heavy, suffocating thing that presses down on you and fills every corner of your mind. Tonight, I take you to the heart of this silence, into the hollowed-out shells we once called cities. These were the beating hearts of humanity, our havens, our homes. Now they are mausoleums of steel and concrete, shrouded in dust and despair. These are the silent cities, empty streets, echoes of what we were. If you listen closely, you might hear them breathe, like ghosts caught between life and death. When the bombs fell and the wars raged, the cities were the first to go. London, New York, Beijing, Tokyo, Rio de Janeiro, all crumbled under the weight of war. But what came after was worse. Imagine it, a city of millions now devoid of human life. Empty skyscrapers loom like sentinels, their glass windows shattered and jagged like teeth. The streets, once choked with traffic and laughter, are now rivers of ash and debris. The air is thick, not with the hum of life, but with a deep, oppressive quiet. The fall of New York was swift and brutal. When the first missiles struck, they hit key infrastructure, bridges, power plants, and transportation hubs. Within hours, the city was plunged into darkness. Those who survived the initial blasts tried to flee, but the tunnels and bridges were already destroyed. A former NYPD officer, Paul Morales, described the city's descent into chaos. "We thought the blackout was temporary, that help was coming. But as the hours turned into days, the city turned on itself. Stores were looted, fires broke out, and the screaming never stopped. By the end of the week, the screaming was gone too. That's when the silence came. Now New York is a shadow of its former self. The Statue of Liberty still stands, but her torch no longer lights the way. The subways are flooded, their tunnels filled with stagnant, toxic water. Rats and stray dogs are the new rulers of the streets, their scurrying and growls the only sounds that break the silence. Paris, the city of light, was one of the first European capitals to fall in the conflict. A tactical nuclear strike on its outskirts caused widespread panic. Millions fled, leaving behind a city frozen in time. The Eiffel Tower still stands, though its iron beams are pockmarked with shrapnel. The Seine runs black with ash and debris, its surface reflecting the dim, gray skies. A survivor, Amélie Laurent, spoke of her return to the city months after the attack. It was like walking through a dream, a nightmare. The streets were empty, but it felt like someone was watching me. The wind carried whispers, or maybe it was just in my head. I saw shadows where there shouldn't have been any. Paris is no longer alive, but it's not dead either. Tokyo, one of the most densely populated cities in the world, became an eerie monument to humanity's fragility. When the bombs fell, they targeted the city's industrial hubs and transportation systems. The result was catastrophic. Now Tokyo is a ghost city. Its neon signs are dark, its bullet trains stop mid-track, covered in rust and overgrowth. The famed Shibuya crossing, once teeming with life, is now a silent grid of abandoned cars and crumbling buildings. But there's something else, something unsettling. Survivors speak of strange sounds in the city at night. Footsteps echoing down empty streets, lights flickering in abandoned skyscrapers. And on rare occasions, the faint sound of a woman singing, her voice carried by the wind. Kenta Mori, a former businessman who hid in the city for months, shared his experience. I don't know what it was, maybe my mind playing tricks on me, but I swear, I heard someone walking above me in an empty building. And once I saw a light, a single room lit up in a tower that should have been dark. I never went back after that. In Russia, the silence is colder, harsher. Cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg have become wastelands, their grand cathedrals and palaces now shelters for scavengers and stray animals. But the real horror lies in the smaller towns and villages surrounding the cities. These places, once bustling with life, are now eerily still. Frozen laundry hangs on lines, untouched meals sit on tables, and children's toys lie abandoned in the snow. It's as if the people simply vanished, leaving behind only the echoes of their lives. A Russian soldier, Vasily, described a reconnaissance mission to one such village. We found no bodies, no signs of a struggle, just silence. We searched every house, but there was no one. At night, we heard whispers, soft and low, like someone calling from far away. None of us could sleep. By morning, we left without finishing the mission. The nuclear fallout from recent strikes reawakened fears of old disasters. In Ukraine, the Chernobyl exclusion zone has expanded, swallowing nearby towns and cities. The eerie landscape of abandoned schools, amusement parks, and hospitals now serves as a grim foreshadowing for countless other regions. But now, new shadows move in Chernobyl. Survivors report strange mutations in the wildlife, wolves with glowing eyes, trees that seem to shift and move in the windless air. An ecologist, Dr. Olena Ivanov, who ventured into the zone, shared her chilling findings. The silence here is not natural. It's heavy like the land itself is mourning. And the animals, they watch you. I've never felt fear like that before, not even during the bombings. It's as if the earth remembers what we've done and is waiting for revenge. For those who remain in the silent cities, the lack of sound becomes a torment in itself. Survivors describe a phenomenon known as phantom noise, the brain's desperate attempt to fill the void. Dr. Martha Caldwell, a psychologist in a makeshift clinic in Kansas, explained, "Many of my patients hear voices or sounds that aren't there. Laughter, music, even the cries of their loved ones. It's their mind's way of coping with the silence, but it often drives them to the brink of madness." These silent cities are more than ruins. They are warnings, monuments to our hubris and our failure to listen to the whispers of history. If you find yourself in one of these places, tread lightly. The silence has a way of consuming you, of pulling you into its depths. Remember, these cities may be silent, but they are not empty. Something remains. Whether it's memories, ghosts, or the shadows of our sins, I do not know. This is Richard Gray, signing off for now. If you're out there, stay safe and stay human. This is Richard Gray. You're listening to The Last Frequency. Tonight, we delve into the blood-soaked veins of this war, the frontlines. If the silent cities are the hollowed-out remains of humanity, then the frontlines are its raw, beating heart. These are the places where survival is measured in seconds, where the ground drinks deeply of the blood of soldiers and civilians alike. The air is thick with smoke, screams, and the metallic stench of death. This is war stripped of its political facades and patriotic slogans. It's chaos, it's carnage, it's the abyss. The front lines weren't always this way. At the start of the war, they were carefully drawn on maps by generals and politicians who thought they could control the chaos. Borders, trenches, strongholds, all meticulously planned. But plans crumble under the weight of desperation and destruction. The front lines now shift daily, consuming entire cities and leaving wastelands in their wake. In some areas, the fighting has been reduced to a brutal stalemate, with trenches stretching for miles, reminiscent of World War I. In others, it's a constant, chaotic dance of retreat and advance. Eastern Europe has become the epicenter of the war. The conflict between NATO and Russian forces has turned vast swaths of land into a scorched wasteland. Villages and towns are nothing more than rubble, their names erased from maps and history alike. In Ukraine, the fields that once blossomed with sunflowers are now craters filled with charred soil and twisted metal. The Dnipro River has turned red, carrying the blood of soldiers and civilians alike. And yet amidst the horror, there are those who fight on. A Ukrainian soldier, Ivan Petrov, shared his harrowing experience in the trenches. We dig our graves every day. The trenches keep us alive, but they also bury us. The nights are the worst. You hear the screams of the wounded, the cries for mothers that will never come. And then there's the silence. It's deafening. You start to wonder if you're already dead. But it's not just soldiers who suffer. Civilians trapped in the crossfire endure unimaginable horrors. A young mother, Anya, spoke of her escape from Mariupol. We hid in the basement for weeks. There was no food, no water, just darkness and the sound of bombs. When we finally ran, we saw things, bodies torn apart, lying in the streets. I covered my son's eyes, but I couldn't cover his ears. While Europe burns, the Pacific Ocean has become a battlefield of its own. Naval fleets from China, the United States, and Japan clash in battles that turn the sea into a graveyard of twisted steel and oil slicks. The islands of the South China Sea are no longer paradises, but strategic points drenched in blood. The once thriving coral reefs are now littered with debris and the bodies of those who fought and died for control. Commander Nathan Brooks of the U.S. Navy described a recent skirmish near the Spratly Islands. It's not like the movies. There's no glory, no heroism, just chaos. Missiles fly, ships burn, and men scream. The water turns black with oil and red with blood. We lost 3 ships that day, 3,000 souls gone in minutes. But the battles aren't confined to the sea. Coastal cities like Manila and Jakarta have become targets, their populations fleeing in terror as missiles rain down from the sky. Refugees swarm inland, bringing tales of firestorms and the sea itself, turning against them. While the eyes of the world remain fixed on Europe and the Pacific, Africa has become a silent casualty of the war. Proxy conflicts rage across the continent as global powers exploit its resources to fuel their war machines. In the Sahel region, militias armed with discarded weapons from the larger powers have turned entire communities into battlegrounds. Refugees flee in every direction, only to find the borders closed and the world's empathy spent elsewhere. A humanitarian worker, Fatima Adeyemi, shared her account from a refugee camp in Sudan. We receive thousands of people every week. They come with nothing, no food, no water, no hope. The children don't cry anymore. They've seen too much, and yet the bombs keep falling, even here. There's no escape. And In the far north, where the icy silence of the Arctic was once a sanctuary, another war rages. The melting ice caps have opened new shipping lanes and untapped resources, turning the region into a battleground for superpowers. Russian and NATO forces engage in brutal skirmishes, their advanced weaponry shattering the frozen landscape. But the true horror lies in the aftermath. The fragile Arctic ecosystem, already weakened by climate change, is collapsing. Dr. Ingrid Sorensen, an environmental scientist stationed in Greenland, described the devastation. The Arctic was already dying. Now it's being murdered. The ice is stained with oil and blood. Polar bears starve, their carcasses dotting the shorelines. And the air, it's thick with the smell of death. The front line isn't just a place, it's a state of existence for millions of people. Soldiers fight and die, often for causes they don't understand. Civilians are caught in the crossfire, their lives shattered in an instant. The numbers are staggering. As of the latest reports, over 12 million soldiers have died worldwide. Civilian casualties exceed 20 million, with millions more displaced. Entire cities, towns, and villages have been erased, leaving no survivors to tell their stories. But these numbers don't capture the true cost. The fathers who won't return, the children who will never grow up, the futures stolen from all of us. I came across a letter today. It was found on the body of a soldier, tucked into his uniform. It read, "To my love, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. I'm sorry. I fought because I believed in a better world for you, for us. I hope you survive this hell and find happiness. Don't forget me. Please don't forget me." This was a man who had a name, a life, a family, and now he's just another statistic, another nameless casualty of this senseless war. The front lines are everywhere now. They're in our cities, our homes, our minds. And if we don't find a way to end this madness, the front lines will be the end of us all. This is Richard Gray signing off. Stay safe, stay human. And if you're out there, fighting or fleeing, know that your story matters. You matter. This is Richard Gray, and you're listening to The Last Frequency. Tonight, we turn our gaze away from the bombs and bloodshed, and instead we focus on something more insidious. War doesn't just destroy lives, it hollows out the very foundations of our world. And tonight, I'll tell you the story of how this war has bled humanity dry, not just of hope, but of wealth, stability, and survival itself. This is the story of the economic collapse, the downfall of nations that once seemed untouchable, and the grim reality faced by the ordinary people left in its wake. Wars aren't fought in isolation. Every bullet, every missile, every tank rolling across a battlefield costs money, trillions of it. And as the war machine churned on, it drained the lifeblood of economies around the globe. The collapse began subtly, like a small crack in a dam. Stock markets trembled as tensions between nations escalated. Companies pulled out of unstable regions, disrupting supply chains. But when the first bombs fell, the cracks widened. Entire economies crumbled under the weight of war. The US dollar, once the bedrock of global trade, lost its value almost overnight. Countries like Russia and China, already isolated by sanctions, retaliated by cutting off vital resources, oil, gas, and rare earth metals. Inflation spiraled out of control. Basic goods became luxuries. Bread, once a staple, became a commodity worth more than gold in some regions. In the heart of New York, Wall Street, once a symbol of global financial power, became a ghost town. When the markets crashed, brokers fled. Offices were abandoned. The iconic bull statue now stands in a barren street covered in ash and graffiti, a hollow symbol of a bygone era. Former investment banker Daniel Foster described the scene during the collapse. It wasn't a crash, it was an implosion. People were screaming, crying, smashing their computers, but the worst part was the silence after. When everyone realized there was no fixing it, no bailout coming, just silence. In the United States, hyperinflation turned everyday items into priceless commodities. A gallon of gasoline cost $1,000 before fuel supplies dried up entirely. A loaf of bread reached $50 in major cities before supermarkets were looted and emptied. Without functional currency, society reverted to bartering. People traded whatever they had, clothes, tools, even family heirlooms, for food and water. In some places, bullets became the new currency, a grim reflection of the times. One survivor, Bethany Clark, shared her story. "I traded my wedding ring for a bag of rice. It was all I had left of my husband, but my children were starving." You make choices you never thought you'd have to make, and you never forget them. Nations once considered economic powerhouses fell one by one. The United States, with its financial systems in shambles, the U.S. government declared martial law. Rationing became mandatory, but supplies dwindled quickly. Millions of Americans were forced to flee cities, joining the ever-growing ranks of the displaced. China, despite its initial resilience, China's economy buckled under the strain of war. A nationwide blackout left entire cities without power or communication. Factories ceased production, and millions lost their livelihoods. The European Union, already weakened by internal divisions, the EU fragmented entirely. Germany, France, and smaller nations turned inward, closing borders and hoarding resources. The euro collapsed, and the continent descended into chaos. The war obliterated the global trade network. Ports became battlegrounds, and shipping routes were littered with sunken vessels. Key trading hubs like Singapore and Rotterdam were bombed into oblivion. Without imports and exports, industries collapsed. Countries that relied on foreign oil were left without fuel. Nations dependent on imported food faced widespread famine. Even the most self-sufficient nations struggled to keep up with the demand for resources. The economic collapse wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was starvation, homelessness, and desperation. Families torn apart. In cities across the globe, families were forced to make heartbreaking decisions. Some sold their children into servitude, hoping they'd have a better chance of survival. Others abandoned their elderly to conserve resources. The rise of refugee camps. Makeshift camps sprang up in rural areas, overcrowded and under-resourced. Disease spread like wildfire, and many died from illnesses that were once easily treatable. Riots and looting, desperation led to violence. Riots broke out in major cities as people fought over dwindling supplies. In Los Angeles, a food riot left over 300 dead when the National Guard opened fire on civilians. While food shortages were devastating, the scarcity of clean water was even worse. In regions where infrastructure was destroyed, rivers and reservoirs became contaminated. In India, the Ganges River turned into a battleground as communities fought for access to its polluted waters. In Africa, entire villages were abandoned as people migrated in search of drinkable water. A farmer from Kenya, Samuel Mwangi, described the desperation. "We walked for days, but every well was dry. My wife, she didn't make it. She collapsed, and I couldn't carry her. I had to leave her there, under the sun." As governments faltered, private corporations filled the power vacuum. Food conglomerates, pharmaceutical giants, and tech companies hoarded resources, offering them only to the highest bidders. In some areas, these corporations essentially became the new governments, establishing their own laws and enforcing them with hired mercenaries. The rich retreated into fortified enclaves, leaving the rest of the world to rot. One whistleblower, a former employee of a major tech firm, revealed they had everything: clean water, fresh food, medicine, but they only gave it to the elites. "We were told to deny access to anyone else, even children. I couldn't do it anymore." The economic collapse didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed hope. Dr. Elena Ruiz, a psychologist working in a refugee camp in Mexico, described the emotional devastation. People don't just mourn their loved ones, they mourn their futures, their dreams. A man who worked his entire life to provide for his family now watches them starve. A mother who saved for her child's education now fights for scraps of food. The grief is endless. This collapse is not just an economic failure, it's a failure of humanity. A failure to share, to care, to see beyond our own borders and ambitions. If you're listening to this, hold on to what little you have left, your kindness, your humanity. Because when the dust settles, it won't be the money or the power that matters. It'll be the people who survived, the ones who didn't lose their souls in the process. This is Richard Gray, broadcasting on the last frequency. Tonight, we delve beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively. While war rages above, while economies crumble and cities fall silent, humanity has turned to the depths for refuge. This is the story of the underground cities, hidden enclaves where survival is not just a goal, but an obsession. What lies below, you ask? Safety, salvation, or perhaps something darker? As the war escalated, the surface became increasingly inhospitable. Nuclear fallout blanketed entire regions, rendering them unlivable. Bombing campaigns destroyed cities, leaving little more than rubble and ash. For those with resources, the only way out was down. Governments, corporations, and the wealthy began constructing underground shelters long before the first missiles fell. These were not simple bunkers. They were sprawling subterranean cities, equipped with everything needed to sustain life. Power grids, water filtration systems, hydroponic farms, even schools and entertainment centers. But as the war dragged on, these underground havens evolved. What began as a temporary solution became a way of life for those lucky, or rich enough to gain access. In Switzerland, beneath the Alps, lies Sanctuary 1, a privately funded underground city built by a coalition of billionaires. Its population consists of the ultra-wealthy, government officials, and a carefully selected workforce of engineers, doctors, and scientists. Sanctuary 1 boasts luxuries unimaginable on the surface: theaters, art galleries, and gourmet dining halls. But these luxuries come at a price. Those deemed non-essential are denied entry, regardless of their need. One construction worker who helped build Sanctuary 1 shared his story anonymously. I worked there for 2 years, dug tunnels, installed air systems, built their damn gardens. When the war started, I asked if my family could come in. They said no, said we didn't qualify. I built that place, and now I'm out here scavenging for scraps. While the wealthy built their sanctuaries, governments around the world developed their own underground facilities. These were not cities of luxury, but militarized complexes designed to sustain leadership through the apocalypse. The U.S., beneath the Rockies, lies Continuity City, a massive government bunker capable of housing 10,000 people. It's heavily guarded, and access is strictly controlled. Civilians attempting to breach its perimeter have been shot on sight. Russia, deep in the Ural Mountains, the Yamantau complex serves as a nerve center for Russian military operations. Rumors suggest it's also a prison for political dissidents and anyone deemed a threat to the state. China, the Zhongnanhai bunker beneath Beijing, is said to be a labyrinthine fortress, but little is known about what happens inside. Whispers from defectors suggest it's less a refuge and more a fortress of control. Not everyone could afford a spot in a government or corporate bunker. Across the world, ordinary people took matters into their own hands, digging their own shelters in basements, subway systems, and abandoned mines. In London, the unused sections of the underground have become a sprawling network of makeshift shelters. Families live crammed into old train cars, their only light coming from flickering generators. One man, Arthur Bailey, described life in the London Underground. It's not living, not really. It's surviving. The air's damp, the walls are covered in mold, and the noise, you hear every drip of water, every scurry of rats. But at least it's safe. At least the bombs can't reach us down here. Living underground comes with its own horrors. Deprived of sunlight, many residents develop shadow sickness, a term used to describe the physical and psychological effects of prolonged subterranean living. Symptoms include weakened immune systems, hallucinations, and severe depression. Dr. Clara Nong, a psychologist working in an underground refugee camp in Taiwan, explained, "People weren't meant to live like this. The lack of sunlight, the isolation, the constant fear, it eats away at the mind. We're seeing spikes in suicides, violence, even psychosis. People are losing their grip on reality." Not all underground cities are sanctuaries. In some, the lines between refuge and prison blur. In Eastern Europe, rumors persist of underground labor camps where refugees are forced to work in exchange for shelter. Survivors speak of brutal conditions, with overseers doling out punishment for the slightest infractions. One refugee, Marta Novak, escaped such a camp in Poland. "They told us it was safe. They lied. We worked until we couldn't stand. Then they threw us in the dark. People disappeared all the time. No one asked questions. We were just bodies to them, tools to be used and discarded." For every underground city, there are countless people left on the surface with nowhere to go. These forgotten ones have become a ghost population, scavenging the ruins of the old world and living in constant fear of radiation, violence, and starvation. They look up at the sky where the ashes of war fall like snow, and they wonder, why were they left behind? The underground cities are a mirror of the world we've destroyed, a reflection of its divisions, its greed, its cruelty. Below the earth, humanity's flaws are magnified, not erased. If we can't learn to coexist, to rebuild with compassion and unity, then these underground sanctuaries will become tombs. And the human race will join the countless species we've already driven to extinction. This concludes tonight's broadcast. Whether you're above ground or below, remember this: no shelter is permanent, no refuge truly safe. The only thing that can save us now is us. Until next time, this is Richard Gray, signing off. Stay alive, stay human.